In the depths of a brutal winter, an experienced pilot commands a Boeing 747 filled with passengers heading to one of the most challenging airports in the Northern Hemisphere. When an unexpected snowstorm transforms the runway into a deadly ice trap, he must make the most difficult decision of his career. Risk a landing in impossible conditions or divert to an alternate airport hundreds of miles away, knowing fuel is at its limit and critically ill passengers are on board. With 512 lives depending on his choice, he'll have only one chance. There are moments in a pilot's life when the operations manual doesn't have all the answers. Moments when years of training, thousands of flight hours, and all available technology become secondary to a single question. Can you do the impossible when 512 people depend on it? My name doesn't matter, doesn't. What matters is that on that frozen January night, I discovered that sometimes the line between heroism and recklessness is as thin as the layer of ice covering that runway. This is the story of how I transformed 200 meters of frozen asphalt into the difference between life and death. I'd been in commercial aviation for over 23 years when that flight happened. I'd logged more than 15,000 flight hours, most of them on long-haul international routes. Flying had become my second nature, that kind of knowledge that isn't just in your mind, but in your muscles, in your reflexes, in the ability to read the sky like reading an open book. That winter afternoon, I was scheduled to command a Boeing 747-400, departing from a major European hub, bound for a northern capital. It was a route I knew well, had flown dozens of times. The weather briefing indicated challenging conditions, but nothing out of the ordinary for that time of year. Strong winds, possibility of snow, temperatures well below freezing. Difficult conditions, yes, but manageable. My co-pilot, Richard, was a competent professional I'd flown with a few times before. We had a full cabin crew, all veterans, people I trusted completely. The aircraft was in perfect condition, all checks performed meticulously. We boarded 512 passengers that afternoon, families returning home, business executives on trips, students, elderly folks, children, each of them trusting that Metal Giant would carry them safely to their destination. Among the passengers was an 8-year-old girl traveling alone to meet her mother, 3 passengers in wheelchairs, and according to what the lead flight attendant discreetly informed me, a 62-year-old man who had suffered a mild heart attack days earlier and was returning home where he would undergo emergency cardiac surgery. Every time I hear someone say flying is routine, I remember that afternoon and how everything seemed perfectly normal, until it wasn't anymore. Takeoff was smooth. We left the gate only 15 minutes late, nothing significant. The sky was overcast, but conditions were still good. We climbed through a layer of grey clouds, and upon reaching cruise altitude, we found that scenery that never loses its charm. An infinite ocean of clouds, illuminated by the setting sun, the sky above tinged with shades of orange and pink. During the first 2 hours of flight, everything went according to plan. Passengers were being served. The aircraft responded perfectly. Systems worked like clockwork. Richard and I chatted about trivial things, that kind of relaxed conversation pilots have during low workload moments. We talked about family, vacation plans, the new restaurant that had opened near the base. Then, about 40 minutes before scheduled landing, the first message from air traffic control came through. Weather conditions deteriorating rapidly at destination airport. Snowstorm intensified. Detailed information about runway condition, friction coefficients, snow removal operations. The answers came quickly, but weren't encouraging. A storm that wasn't forecast on the weather charts had developed with surprising speed. Snow removal equipment was working, but precipitation was so intense they could barely keep up. Other aircraft that had landed minutes earlier reported extremely difficult conditions. Poor braking, slippery runway. 2 aircraft had opted to divert to alternate airports. I quickly calculated our options. We had enough fuel for one approach attempt, a possible go-around and diversion to the alternate, which was approximately 320 kilometers away. It was tight, but viable within safety limits. Richard looked at me, that expression experienced pilots exchange when they know the flight is about to get interesting. "Shall we try?" he asked. "We'll assess when we get there," I replied. "If it doesn't look good, we'll divert." It seemed simple, it seemed controllable, but nothing that night would be simple. We began our descent in moderate turbulence. The aircraft shook, but nothing concerning for an aircraft of that size. As we descended through the clouds, turbulence increased. I could feel the tension in the passenger cabin through the intercom when the lead flight attendant called to report they'd secured all carts and instructed passengers to remain seated with seatbelts fastened. Snow began hitting the windshield as we emerged from the cloud base, large dense flakes falling in thick curtains that reduced visibility. I activated the de-icing systems, increased the wiper intensity. The landing lights illuminated that white whirlwind ahead of us, hypnotic and disturbing at the same time. That's when everything changed. The air traffic controller's voice cut through the radio with barely concealed urgency. Attention. We've just received information that the alternate airport is closing operations due to weather conditions, zero visibility, severe snow accumulation, not accepting aircraft. I felt my stomach tighten. Richard looked at me, his face suddenly tense. "Are they kidding?" he murmured. They weren't. I requested confirmation. The answer was clear. The alternate was closed, no forecast for reopening in the next 2 hours. The storm was moving faster than any weather forecast had indicated, covering a much larger area than expected. I quickly calculated other options. The next airport capable of receiving a 747 was over 500 kilometers away. Our fuel wasn't sufficient. Even flying at the most economical altitude and speed, we'd arrive there with tanks practically empty. No margin for error, no possibility of holding or go-around. It was technically possible, but too risky. We'd left that comfortable zone where everything is under control and entered that grey territory, where each decision has potentially catastrophic consequences. "Request updated runway conditions," I transmitted to the tower. The response came after a few seconds that felt like an eternity. Runway 28, total length 3,000 meters. Friction coefficient measured 10 minutes ago, 0.15 in the first 1,000 meters, 0.10 in the middle 1,000 meters. Data unavailable for the final third due to equipment malfunction. Cleaning crews report compacted ice layer under the snow. Crosswinds varying between 15 and 25 knots. Gusts up to 35 knots. The numbers hit me like punches. A friction coefficient of 0.15 is considered extremely low. For reference, a dry runway has a coefficient above 0.6. With 0.15, we were talking about minimal braking conditions, where the aircraft would slide over the ice almost like a sled, and with no data available on the final third of the runway, there was no way to know if that section would be better or worse. Richard began calculating landing distances. His fingers flew over the onboard computer, entering data. Our current weight, airport elevation, outside temperature of minus 17 degrees Celsius, wind, runway slope. With maximum reverses and maximum braking, in ideal 0.15 conditions, we'd need approximately 2,800 meters, he announced. But that doesn't account for compacted ice or the possibility of worse conditions in the final third of the runway. I looked at the instruments. We had 512 people on board. My responsibility, my decision. I could feel the weight of those lives as if I were physically carrying each one of them on my shoulders. We'll make an approach, I decided. If, when we break through the clouds, I don't like what I see, we'll go around and proceed to the airport 500 kilometers away. We'll have to manage fuel very carefully, but it's possible. Richard nodded. We both knew that decision had its own complications. Arriving at the distant airport with fuel at the limit meant we'd have no margin for error. No possibility of holding, no missed approach attempt. It would be get in, land, or declare a fuel emergency. We initiated the final approach. The tower guided us through the procedures, the controller's voice trying to sound routine, but I could sense the underlying tension. He knew this wouldn't be an ordinary approach. We configured the aircraft for landing. Flaps extended, landing gear down and locked, speed controlled. The 747 descended smoothly through the snow, a 350-ton giant cutting through turbulent air with the awkward grace that characterizes those magnificent machines. That's when the lead flight attendant called again. Her voice was calm, but there was something in it that made me pay full attention. "Captain, the passenger with heart problems is doing very badly. He's having chest pains, profuse sweating, difficulty breathing. We have a doctor on board providing first aid, but she says he needs urgent hospital care. She thinks he may be having another heart attack. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. A life in immediate danger inside my aircraft. It was no longer just a question of difficult weather or friction coefficients. It was a race against time, with real and immediate human consequences. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the Kaisha Preta channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories from the skies. Every story shared here helps us learn and make aviation increasingly safe. Understood, I replied. Inform the doctor we're on final approach. We'll be on the ground in less than 15 minutes. But as I spoke those words, part of my mind was screaming, 15 minutes if we manage to land on that impossible runway. We broke through the cloud base at 300 meters altitude. What I saw through the window made my heart race. The runway was a narrow white strip in the middle of a white field. I could barely distinguish where the runway ended and the shoulder began. The edge lights were small yellow dots, almost swallowed by the snow. Wind pushed dense curtains of snow across the visual field, reducing visibility to no more than 400 meters. But what worried me most was the runway surface. Under the lights, I could see an uneven layer of snow and ice, with darker patches where the ice was probably more compacted. It wasn't a runway. It was a skating rink. Jesus, Richard murmured beside me. Go around, I asked, more to myself than to him. I had seconds to decide. I looked at the fuel gauges, quickly calculated the distance to the other airport. Thought about the man having a heart attack in the passenger cabin. Thought about the 512 lives depending on my decision. And then I saw something. In the final third of the runway, where there was no friction data, the surface appearance was slightly different. It looked less covered with snow, as if the cleaning crews had managed to work better in that section. It wasn't a certainty. It was an observation. A hope based on years of experience reading runways under different conditions. We're landing, I announced. My voice sounded firmer than I felt. But we'll do it differently. We're going to aim to land as far down the runway as possible. Use that final third that looks to be in better condition. Richard looked at me as if I'd lost my mind. Captain, that goes against all procedures. We always land as close to the threshold as possible to have maximum runway available for braking. I know, I replied. But if we put the wheels down at the beginning of this runway, we'll slide through the first two-thirds without real control. We'll probably go off the runway or not be able to stop in time. If we skip the first third, the middle, and touch down directly on that final third that looks better, we'll have friction where we really need it, in the most critical phase of braking. It was a risky gamble, completely unconventional. It meant deliberately flying over part of the usable runway, reducing our safety margin, betting everything on a visual observation that the final third was in better condition. If I was wrong, if that section was also covered in ice, we'd overshoot the end of the runway at high speed. The consequences would be catastrophic. Are you sure about this? Richard asked. His voice trembled slightly. No, I replied honestly, but it's the best chance we've got. I transmitted to the tower. Tower, due to exceptional runway conditions, will execute a long landing, touching down approximately at the runway midpoint. There was a pause. The controller had probably never heard such a request. Confirm you understand your intention for long landing? Affirmative. Intentional long landing due to analysis of surface conditions. Understood. The decision is the captain's. You're cleared to land runway 28, wind 250 degrees, 22 knots, gusts of 30, visibility 400 meters in heavy snow. I adjusted the approach. Instead of aiming at the runway threshold, I was aiming at a point 1,500 meters ahead. Every fiber of my training was screaming that this was wrong, that I was violating fundamental principles of flight safety. But my experience, that inner voice that develops after thousands of hours studying runways, conditions, friction, told me it was the only chance. The approach had to be perfect. I couldn't touch down too early or too late. I had a window of maybe 200 meters to hit the exact spot. 100 feet, Richard announced the altitude. The aircraft shook with turbulence and crosswind. I made constant corrections to the controls, feeling the resistance of the control surfaces, keeping the wings level. 50 feet. The runway approached fast. I could see every detail now. The tire marks darkened under the snow, the lights trembling in the blizzard. the irregular texture of the icy surface. 30 feet. My right hand on the yoke, left on the thrust levers, eyes fixed on the touchdown point I'd chosen, heart pounding like a drum. 20 feet. The 747's nose pointed slightly upward. The wind tried to push us sideways. I corrected with pressure on the rudder pedal. 10 feet. The world reduced to that moment. There were no longer the 512 passengers, no man having a heart attack, no Richard beside me or control tower or anything else. There was only me, the aircraft, and that impossible piece of frozen runway. The sensation of a landing isn't something easily described to someone who's never piloted. There's that moment of suspension, when the aircraft is just a few feet from the ground, still flying, but already committed to the landing, when you're no longer totally in the air, nor totally on the ground, when every small adjustment to the controls is the difference between perfection and disaster. I cut the power. The 747 sank the last few feet. The main wheels touched the ground exactly where I'd planned, 1,500 meters past the runway threshold. In that final third I hoped, prayed, would be in better condition. The impact was firm, nothing smooth. I wanted those tires to establish solid contact with the asphalt beneath the ice. Instantly I opened the reversers to maximum. The deafening roar of the turbines reversing their thrust filled the cockpit. I applied the brakes progressively, feeling the response through the pedals, and that's when I realized my gamble was correct. The friction in that section of runway was better. Not good, not even adequate by normal standards, but better than the first two-thirds. I could feel the brakes biting, albeit weakly. The aircraft was decelerating, but not enough. I looked ahead through the windshield being battered by snow. The end of the runway was appearing very, very fast. "Speed 140 knots, Richard announced, his voice tense. 120 knots. I increased pressure on the brakes. The anti-skid system worked frantically, preventing the wheels from locking completely. I felt the aircraft vibrating, the immense weight fighting against physics, against inertia, against that treacherous layer of ice still covering part of the surface. 100 knots. The end of the runway was maybe 500 meters away. Very close. Dangerously close. 80 knots. Speed was dropping, but not fast enough. I forced the brakes beyond what would normally be prudent. I heard the warning system alerting about brake temperature, about hydraulic pressure. I ignored everything. 60 knots. 300 meters to the end of the runway. If we overran, there was a safety area, but beyond it, uneven terrain, obstacles. At speeds above 50 knots, it would be catastrophic. 40 knots. 100 meters. The 350-ton giant was crawling now, its momentum nearly defeated, but still dangerously present. 20 knots. 50 meters. And then, with an almost anticlimactic smoothness, the aircraft stopped, completely motionless. Silence. The roar of the reversers ceased, just the whistle of wind and the drumming of snow on metal. We were stopped at exactly 18 meters from the end of the runway. I measured it later. 18 meters. We used 2,982 meters of a 3,000-meter runway. Only 18 meters remained, less than the length of the aircraft's own fuselage. I'd transformed that impossible bet into reality by a margin of 18 meters. I looked at Richard. He was pale, hands still gripping the armrests of his seat, eyes wide. "My God," he whispered. "My God, you did it." I didn't respond immediately. My hands were trembling now as the adrenaline began to dissipate. I'd bet everything and won, but just barely, so marginally, that the line between success and tragedy had been measured in meters. "Tower," I transmitted, trying to keep my voice steady. "Safely on the ground. Request emergency medical vehicles on the runway. We have a passenger needing urgent care." "Received." The controller's voice sounded relieved. "Medical teams are already on their way. Excellent work, Captain." But he didn't know. Nobody besides me and Richard knew how close we'd come to the limit. I took a deep breath, forcing myself back into operational mode. The landing had been only part of the challenge. We still had to taxi that enormous machine through snow-covered taxiways to the terminal. Every movement had to be calculated, delicate. With that amount of ice, any abrupt application of power or brakes could make us skid or spin. You're listening to a true story from the skies. If you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Kaisha Preta and share with friends who love aviation. Stories like this remind us of the courage and dedication of the professionals who fly every day. It took us almost 15 minutes to cover the route that would normally take 5. Each turn was a negotiation with physics. Finally, we arrived at the gate. Ground crews were waiting, the ambulance already positioned. The moment we shut down the engines was surreal. That profound silence that only exists after an aircraft's turbines stop, when you suddenly become aware of how loud everything had been. I removed my headset, ran my hands over my face. I was drenched in sweat despite the freezing temperature outside. "You saved 512 lives today," Richard said quietly. "You know that, don't you?" I looked at him, then at the instruments before me, that complex panel that had been my world for the last eternal minutes. "I saved," I replied slowly, "or nearly killed. The difference was 18 meters. But you didn't kill. You made the right decision." I wasn't sure about that. Not in that moment, nor in the weeks that followed. That night in the hotel, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every second of that landing, every decision, every movement of the controls. What if the final third of the runway had also had bad ice? What if I'd touched down 5 meters earlier or 5 meters later? What if the wind had given a stronger gust at that critical moment? What if? The following weeks were a roller coaster. The airline initially celebrated me as a hero. The story leaked to the press. Pilot performs miraculous landing in impossible conditions, saves over 500 lives. I received letters from passengers thanking me, saying they had families they returned to thanks to my skill. The 8-year-old girl sent me a drawing of a plane landing in the snow, with a smiling sun in the corner, and written below in childish handwriting, "Thank you for taking me to my mum." I kept that drawing. It's framed in my office to this day. But there was also the investigation. Because there's always an investigation when you break procedures, even when it works out. Civil aviation authorities wanted to understand why I'd deliberately chosen to land long violating established protocols. I had to explain my reasoning dozens of times. I had to defend every second of that decision. Some investigators agreed it was the correct choice, given the unique circumstances. Others argued I'd exposed passengers to unnecessary risk, that I should have diverted to the distant airport despite fuel limitations, that I should have declared an emergency and requested absolute priority. The man with heart problems survived. I learned later he arrived at the hospital in time, underwent emergency surgery and recovered completely. He called me months later. Said the doctors explained that if the landing had been delayed another 15 or 20 minutes, he probably wouldn't have survived. "You didn't just land the plane," he told me, his voice emotional. "You gave me more years with my grandchildren. How do I thank you for that?" I didn't know what to answer. I still don't. In the end, I was exonerated from any responsibility. The official report concluded that, given the extraordinary circumstances, the unexpected closure of the ultimate, the critical medical condition of the passenger, fuel limitations, and my experienced assessment of runway conditions, the decision to land long was unconventional but justifiable. Justifiable, what an interesting word. It means it wasn't right or wrong. It means it was somewhere in the middle, in that grey zone where we live when circumstances force us to go beyond the manual. I returned to flying 3 weeks later. My first flight after the incident was frightening. Every approach, every landing, I became hyper-aware of every detail, every variable. I'd developed something the company psychologists called post-trauma hypervigilance. It wasn't fear of flying. It was a weight of responsibility that had become almost physical. It took months of sessions with aviation psychologists for me to fully trust my instincts again, to accept that day had been exceptional, that I didn't need to replicate that intensity of analysis on every routine flight. I retired from commercial aviation 2 years after that incident, not because of it directly, but because I realized that day had changed something fundamental in me. If I'd seen very clearly the weight of responsibility, had felt very intensely what it means to have 512 lives in your hands, had walked very close to that line between success and disaster. Today, I work as a flight instructor. I teach young pilots not just to command aircraft, but to understand that flying is much more than operating controls and following procedures. It's about judgment, about reading situations that aren't in the manuals, about knowing when to follow the rules and when circumstances require you to think beyond them. Whenever I tell this story to my students, and I tell it frequently, I emphasize not the heroism or technical skill, but the responsibility. You're going to spend most of your careers flying by procedures, I tell them. And that's correct. Procedures exist because they were written with the blood and lessons of those who came before. But there will be moments, rare but inevitable, when procedures don't cover the unique situation you face. In those moments, you'll have to decide based on experience, intuition, and judgment. And you'll have to live with those decisions for the rest of your lives. The cardiac passenger, who became my friend in the following years, once asked me if I didn't regret it. If that weight, that responsibility, those 18 meters that separated success from tragedy, didn't haunt me. Every night, I replied honestly, but I don't regret the decision. I regret being put in that position. I regret that the storm developed so fast, that the forecast systems failed, that the alternate closed. I regret you were having a heart attack on my plane, but the decision itself, no. It was the best I could make with the information and options I had at that moment. The aviation industry learned from that incident. Weather forecasting protocols in the region were revised. Communication procedures between primary and alternate airports were improved. New studies were done on landing techniques in low-friction conditions. In a way, those 18 meters, the impossible margin between disaster and salvation, became part of the collective knowledge that makes aviation a little safer every day. A few years ago, I was at a flight safety conference when a younger pilot approached. He'd flown that same route, to that same airport, faced similar conditions. "I read the report of your landing," he said, "and it helped me. I faced a situation not as extreme, but difficult. And I remembered your analysis, the way you visually assessed runway conditions, how you weren't afraid to break procedure when the situation demanded it. I made my own judgment based on the situation I had, and it worked. I wanted to thank you. It was in that moment I finally made peace with that day. See how it works? We fly not just to transport people from one place to another. We fly to learn, to teach, to add to the collective knowledge that keeps everyone safer. Every flight, every decision, every landing, especially the difficult ones, becomes part of the shared wisdom of aviation. 18 meters. That's what separated 512 people from their families, their lives, their futures. 18 meters made possible by years of training, thousands of hours of experience, and a moment of judgment when everything was at stake. Sometimes I still dream about that landing. In the dream, the runway is even shorter, the ice even thicker, and I wake with heart racing, hands sweaty, the weight of those 512 lives still pressing on my chest. But then, I remember, we made it. We touched down on that final third of the runway. We braked on that impossible surface. We stopped with 18 meters to spare, and 512 people returned home, to their families, to their lives, including a man who gained more years with his grandchildren, including an 8-year-old girl who found her mother, including all those who trusted their lives to a pilot who, on that frozen January day, had to transform the impossible into possible. I'm not a hero. Heroes don't shake afterwards. Heroes don't spend sleepless nights replaying every decision. Heroes don't need months of therapy to process the weight of responsibility. I'm just a pilot who had enough luck, skill, experience, and judgment to make the right decision when it mattered, and who lives with those 18 meters as a constant reminder that, in aviation, the difference between life and death can be measured in meters, seconds, or in a fraction of judgment. Every second we lived after that landing was a gift. And every day I'm grateful those 18 meters were enough. Every time I see an aircraft take off or land, I think about how many invisible decisions are happening in that cockpit, how many calculations, assessments, judgments that passengers will never know. Every flight is a testament to the skill, dedication, and responsibility of pilots around the world who make the impossible look routine. But sometimes, just sometimes, the routine becomes extraordinary. And it's in those moments we discover what we're really made of. This was the story of how 200 meters of ice-covered runway became the difference between disaster and redemption. But what about you? Have you ever imagined what you'd do if you had only 18 meters between you and catastrophe? Sometimes life puts us in situations where there's no instruction manual, where we have to trust instinct, experience, and make that impossible choice. What would you choose? If this story touched you, leave your comment below sharing what you thought. Subscribe to the Kaisha Prater channel for more true stories from the skies, where each story is a reminder of the courage and competence of the professionals who fly. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode and share with someone who needs to hear this story. After all, we all face our own impossible landings in life. See you in the skies.